You missed a spot, Omega Trash." The words hit like ice water, sharp and cutting in the humid air of the training arena. Lyra felt them settle in her chest the way they always did, a familiar ache that she had learned to carry without flinching. She kept her head down, her grey eyes fixed on the crimson stains that had soaked deep into the packed earth beneath her knees. Blood from this morning's sparring session, when the warriors had pushed themselves harder than usual, preparing for something big that no one bothered to explain to someone like her. She was nothing here, less than nothing. The other Omegas at least had families, had some small place in the pack hierarchy. Lyra had been found as a child, abandoned at the gates with no scent marking, no identifying features, no history. Just a small girl with strange silver-grey eyes and an unsettling habit of humming melodies that made the older pack members uncomfortable. They had taken her in out of duty, nothing more, and she had spent every day since trying to earn even the smallest scrap of belonging. The voice belonged to Marcus, one of the younger betas who took particular pleasure in reminding her of her place. She could smell his satisfaction. The way his wolf preened at having an audience of his friends watching him put the packless girl in her place. Lyra dipped her scrub brush back into the bucket of murky water and attacked the bloodstain with renewed vigour, her movements practised and efficient. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. "I said you missed a spot." Marcus's boot came down inches from her hands, close enough that dirty water splashed across her already stained apron. The pack members who had gathered to watch their evening entertainment laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the arena. This was how they ended most training days, with Lyra on her knees scrubbing away the evidence of their strength while they reminded her that she would never possess any of her own. The Northern Pack's compound was built for war. Every stone had been laid with defence in mind, every corridor designed to funnel attackers into kill zones. The training arena sat at the heart of it all, a circular space surrounded by towering walls where the Pack's warriors honed their skills for the battles that seemed to come more frequently each passing season. And when the warriors were done, when the blood had been spilled and the dominance established, someone had to clean it up. That someone was always Lyra. She moved her brush to the spot Marcus had indicated, though she knew perfectly well it was already clean. Her wolf, weak and small as it was, whimpered somewhere deep inside her chest. Not in pain exactly, but in a kind of resigned sadness that had become as much a part of her as breathing. She had stopped asking why years ago. Some people were born to lead, to fight, to matter. Others were born to serve. The laughter died away as the warriors grew bored and began to disperse, heading toward the dining hall where the evening meal would be laid out by the kitchen staff. None of them would think to invite her, of course. She would eat later, alone, whatever scraps remained after the pack had taken their fill. That had always been enough. But as the arena emptied, Lyra became aware of a different kind of quiet settling over the space. Not the usual silence that followed the warrior's departure, but something deeper, more watchful. She glanced up from her scrubbing, her hand stilling on the brush handle. The war beast enclosures lined the far wall of the arena, massive steel cages built to contain creatures that were more weapon than animal. Most of the time they paced and snarled, a constant background of barely controlled violence that everyone in the compound had learned to ignore. But now they were silent, every one of them pressed against the front bars of their cages, their glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Lyra rose slowly to her feet, her heart beginning to beat faster. She had cleaned around the enclosures countless times, had grown accustomed to the way the beasts watched her with hungry calculation, always looking for weakness, for opportunity. But this was different. This felt like recognition. At the centre of the row, in the largest and most heavily reinforced cage, something massive shifted in the shadows. Fenris, the Alpha King's personal war beast, a creature of legend that had torn through enemy lines like paper, that had never submitted to any handler except King Darius himself. the beast that had killed 3 trainers and put 2 more in the infirmary before they had given up trying to manage him. As Lyra watched, frozen, Fenris emerged from the darkness at the back of his enclosure. He was enormous, easily twice the size of a normal wolf, his black fur marked with silver scars that told the story of a dozen battles. His eyes were the pale gold of ancient amber, and they were fixed on her with an intelligence that seemed almost human, almost reverent. Without thinking, Lyra took a step closer to the cages, her cleaning supplies forgotten. The melody that had been humming in the back of her mind all day, the wordless tune that always seemed to surface when she was alone, began to spill from her lips in a soft, unconscious whisper. It was an old song, something that felt like memory, though she could never remember learning it. The effect was immediate. Every war beast in the enclosures went completely still, their ears pricked forward, their hostile energy transforming into something that looked almost like peace. Fenris pressed himself against the bars of his cage, his massive head tilted as if trying to catch every note of her song. Lyra's voice trailed off as she realized what she was doing, the melody dying in her throat. The spell broken, the beasts began to stir again, but their earlier aggression had been replaced by something else, something that looked dangerously close to longing. She stumbled backward, her heart racing. This wasn't normal. War beasts were bred for violence, trained to respond only to strength and dominance. They didn't go quiet for servant girls who hummed lullabies. They certainly didn't look at her like she was something precious, something worth protecting. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the arena entrance, the heavy tread of warriors returning from the dining hall. Lyra grabbed her bucket and brush, her movements clumsy with sudden panic. Whatever had just happened, she couldn't let anyone see it. She was already too different, already walked too close to the edge of the pack's tolerance. But as she hurried toward the servants' exit, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Tomorrow the Alpha King would arrive for his annual inspection of the war beasts, the visit that everyone had been preparing for with such desperate intensity. King Darius, the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, would walk through these very enclosures and evaluate his living weapons. And somehow Lyra knew with bone-deep certainty that everything was about to change. Behind her, in the gathering darkness of his cage, Fenris continued to watch her retreating form with those ancient, knowing eyes. In the depths of his throat, so quietly that no human ear could catch it, the great war beast began to hum the same melody she had been singing, the same melody that had once been a lullaby sung to royal children before the bloodline had been lost, before the old ways had been forgotten, before a servant girl with silver eyes had begun to remember what she was never supposed to know. The great hall had been hastily prepared for the ceremony, ancient tapestries unfurled from storage, and the ceremonial braziers lit for the first time in 3 decades. The entire pack had gathered, despite the lingering smoke from the morning's battle, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and anticipation as they witnessed something that had passed into legend. The mating ceremony of a true Alpha King and Alpha Queen, the restoration of the ancient partnership that had founded their people. Lyra stood at the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the profound rightness of this moment. She wore the ceremonial robes that had belonged to her grandmother, silver silk that seemed to capture and reflect the light of every flame in the hall. The ancient crown of the Alpha Queens rested on her head, recovered from the royal vaults where it had waited 30 years for her return. "Are you ready?" Fenris asked through their mental connection. The great war beast stood beside her as her guardian and witness, his presence a reminder of how far she had come from the frightened servant who had once scrubbed his cage. "I've been ready my whole life," she whispered back. "I just didn't know it." King Darius waited for her at the far end of the hall, standing before the assembled pack with the kind of presence that commanded attention from every soul in the room. He wore the ceremonial armour of his forefathers, but it was the expression in his pale blue eyes that took her breath away. Not the cold assessment of a political alliance, but the warm recognition of a man looking at his destined mate. The walk down the length of the great hall felt like stepping into destiny itself. With each step, Lyra could feel the weight of generations settling around her, the approval of ancestors who had fought and died to preserve the bloodline that now pulsed in her veins. The pack members she passed dropped to one knee in acknowledgement, their earlier scepticism replaced by reverence earned through battle and awakening. When she reached the dais where King Darius waited, he extended his hand to her with a smile that transformed his entire face. Gone was the stern Alpha King who ruled through strength and dominance. In his place stood a man who had found the other half of his soul after years of searching without knowing what he was looking for. "Your Majesty," he said formally, though his voice carried undertones of warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Do you come here of your own free will to claim your rightful place as Alpha Queen and mate to the Alpha King?" "I do," Lyra replied, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "I come to claim what is mine by right of birth and choice of heart." The ancient words of the ceremony began, spoken by Henrik in the sacred tongue that had been used for such rituals since the dawn of their people. But for Lyra, the formal recitation faded into background as she found herself lost in the intensity of King Darius's gaze. This close, she could see the man beneath the crown, could sense the depth of emotion he kept carefully controlled beneath his royal composure. "The bonds of kingship are political," Henrik intoned, his aged voice carrying the weight of tradition. "But the bonds of true mating are spiritual, forged by destiny and sealed by choice. Do you, Darius of the Northern Pack, Alpha King of the Territories, take this woman as your mate and queen?" "I do," King Darius replied, his voice steady despite the profound significance of the moment. "I claim her as my mate, my equal, my partner in all things." "Now," Fenris whispered through their mental connection, "now comes the true magic." Henrik raised his hands, calling upon the ancient powers that had blessed such ceremonies since the first Alpha Kings learned to shift beneath the moon. The very air in the great hall seemed to shimmer with anticipation as supernatural forces awakened in response to the sacred ritual. "Then let the bond be sealed," Henrik declared. "Let the mate connection be forged in light and power, witnessed by the pack and blessed by the spirits of our ancestors." King Darius stepped closer, his hands finding hers with gentle reverence. The moment their skin touched, the mate bond that had been building between them since their first meeting blazed to life with an intensity that took her breath away. Golden light erupted from the point of contact, spreading outward in waves of warmth and connection that seemed to touch every soul in the great hall. But this was more than simple magic. This was recognition on the deepest possible level, the acknowledgement of two spirits that had been searching for each other across lifetimes. Lyra felt her consciousness expand to encompass his, felt his thoughts and emotions flowing into hers in a river of shared experience and mutual devotion. "Mine!" his mental voice whispered through their newly completed bond. "Finally, completely mine!" "Yours," she replied, the word carrying all the love and trust and fierce devotion that had been building in her heart since the night he told her she wasn't nobody, always yours. The golden light reached its crescendo and then gradually faded, leaving behind a connection that would endure until death and beyond. Every person in the great hall could feel it, could sense the profound rightness of the bond that had just been forged. This wasn't a political marriage or a strategic alliance. This was destiny fulfilling itself in the most spectacular way possible. "Behold!" Henrik announced, his voice cracking with emotion. "The true Alpha King and Alpha Queen, mated and bonded before the eyes of our people and the blessing of our ancestors." The roar of approval that rose from the assembled pack shook the very stones of the great hall. Warriors who had fought beside King Darius for years cheered with genuine joy, while the servants and Omegas who had known Lyra in her previous life wept with happiness at her incredible transformation. But it was Fenris's response that moved her most deeply. The great war beast lifted his massive head and released a howl of triumph that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the earth, a sound of victory and completion that spoke to something primal in every wolf present. "It is finished," he told her through their eternal connection. "The true royal line is restored. The ancient balance has returned." King Darius, her mate now in the deepest possible sense, leaned down to whisper against her ear. "Are you ready for the rest of our lives, my queen?" Lyra looked out over the cheering crowd, over the pack that had once dismissed her as worthless and now celebrated her as their sovereign. She felt the weight of the crown on her head, the warmth of the mate bond in her heart, and the steady presence of Fenris at her side. "With you," she replied, turning to meet his gaze with eyes that blazed with silver light and absolute certainty. "I'm ready for anything." And as their lips met in the first kiss of their eternal bond, the great hall erupted in celebration that would echo through the ages, marking the moment when two halves of a destined whole finally became complete. 3 months after the mate bond completed, Lyra stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, watching the sun set over territory that had transformed under her influence. The compound below bustled with activity that spoke of prosperity and purpose, no longer the rigid hierarchy of fear she had known as a servant, but a thriving community where every member understood their worth. The changes had been gradual but profound. The War Beast program, once a source of violence and barely controlled chaos, had become the envy of every pack in the Northern Territories. Under her guidance, the creatures served not as weapons of destruction, but as partners in defence, their loyalty earned through respect rather than dominated through fear. Other packs sent delegations to learn her methods, seeking to understand how the Northern Pack had achieved such unprecedented harmony between wolf and beast. "You are thinking too hard," Fenris observed from where he lay stretched in the afternoon sunlight. Even in his relaxed state, the great war beast remained alert to every nuance of her mood, their bond deeper now than it had ever been. "Your success troubles you when it should bring peace." "It's not the success that troubles me," Lyra replied, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. "It's the responsibility that comes with it." The pregnancy was barely a month along, too early for anyone else to detect, but her awakened senses had recognized the change immediately. A new life growing within her, carrying the combined bloodlines of the Alpha King and Alpha Queen, heir to a legacy that stretched back to the founding of their people. The thought should have filled her with joy, and it did, but it also carried the weight of everything she had learned about the cost of royal blood. "The child will be strong," Fenris assured her, his mental voice warm with affection, protected by parents who understand the value of both power and compassion. "Will it be enough?" Lyra asked, voicing the fear that had been haunting her dreams. "My grandmother tried to protect the royal bloodline, and still the massacre happened. Still the line was almost lost forever." The sound of approaching footsteps drew her from her brooding, and she turned to see King Darius emerging onto the balcony with the controlled grace that never failed to make her pulse quicken. 3 months of marriage had only deepened their connection, the mate bond allowing them to share not just thoughts and emotions, but dreams and fears and hopes for the future. "The council meeting ran longer than expected," he said, moving to stand beside her at the stone railing. "The Blood Moon Pack is requesting formal terms for surrender. It seems their defeat in the Dawn Assault convinced them that further resistance would be futile." "Elena?" Lyra asked, though she already knew the answer from the grim set of his jaw. "Dead," Darius confirmed, killed by her own allies when they realized her intelligence had led them into a trap rather than an easy victory. Even in exile, she couldn't escape the consequences of her choices. There should have been satisfaction in Elena's fate, some sense of justice served for the woman who had tried to murder her and then betrayed their people to foreign enemies. Instead, Lyra felt only sadness for the waste of potential, for a life twisted by jealousy into something destructive and ultimately self-defeating. She could have been a powerful ally, Lyra mused, her hands still resting on the secret growing within her, if she had chosen to see strength in others rather than threat to herself. Darius moved closer, his arms sliding around her waist with the easy intimacy of their completed bond. "You're more generous than she deserved," he said, his voice carrying the warmth that was reserved only for her. "But then, generosity has always been one of your greatest strengths." "Tell him," Fenris urged, lifting his great head to fix them both with knowing amber eyes. "Tell him about the child. He has the right to know, and the knowledge will bring him joy." Lyra leaned into her mate's embrace, drawing strength from the steady beat of his heart against her back. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that changes everything again." She felt Darius go very still, his enhanced senses no doubt detecting the subtle changes in her scent that had told her about the pregnancy. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder that made her heart skip. "How long have you known?" he asked, his arms tightening around her with protective instincts that were older than conscious thought. A few days," she admitted. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything. I wanted to understand what it meant for us, for the pack, for the future we're trying to build." Darius turned her in his arms, his pale blue eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. "It means everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means the bloodline is truly secure, that our children will grow up in a world where they never have to hide what they are." The kiss he gave her was gentle and reverent, a celebration of the life they had created and the future they would build together. When they finally broke apart, Lyra could see tears of joy in his eyes, the carefully controlled Alpha King allowing himself to show vulnerability in the safety of their private bond. "The pack will celebrate," he continued, his hands moving to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "A royal heir, born to parents who chose each other rather than settled for political alliance. The poets will write songs about this child for generations." "As they should," Fenris added, rising to his feet to pad over and press his massive head against Lyra's free hand. "This child will be legend, born of true love, protected by ancient magic, guided by parents who understand the balance between strength and mercy." Lyra looked out over the thriving territory, over the pack members going about their evening routines in the peaceful harmony she had helped create. The servant girl, who had once scrubbed floors while dreaming of belonging, had become the queen who ensured that belonging was available to everyone who sought it with sincere heart. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Darius, the question that had been lurking in the back of her mind since the night everything changed. "Do you ever wish you had chosen someone with royal training, someone who knew how to be a queen from birth?" Darius laughed, the sound rich and warm, and filled with absolute certainty. "Never," he said, pulling her closer until she could feel the solid strength of his body against hers. "You were exactly who I needed, exactly who our people needed. A queen who remembers what it feels like to be powerless, who rules with compassion because she knows the cost of cruelty." "He speaks truth," Fenris confirmed, his mental voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "You were shaped by suffering not to be broken by it, but to ensure that others need not endure what you survived. That is what makes you worthy to rule." As the last light of sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lyra felt a deep peace settle over her. The journey from servant to queen had been painful and terrifying and wonderful beyond imagining. But here, on this balcony with her mate's arms around her and her guardian's devotion surrounding her, she finally understood that every moment of that journey had been leading to this, to a future where royal children would be born not in fear and hiding, but in joy and celebration, to a pack where strength and compassion walked hand in hand, to a world where worth was determined not by bloodline alone, but by the courage to protect what mattered most. "I love you," she whispered to Darius, the words carrying all the gratitude and devotion and fierce hope that filled her heart. "And I love you," he replied, his voice a promise that would endure through whatever challenges lay ahead. "My queen, my mate, my heart." "And I serve you both," Fenris added, completing the triangle of loyalty and love that would guard their child and their people for generations to come. The future had never looked brighter. 6 months later, Lyra stood on the same balcony where she had revealed her pregnancy to Darius, but everything had changed. Her hand rested on the gentle curve of her belly, where their child grew strong and healthy, already showing signs of the powerful bloodline that flowed in its veins. The territory spread below her had evolved beyond her wildest dreams, transformed from a military compound into something that looked more like the prosperous capital of a peaceful kingdom. The morning sun caught the silver threads woven through her dark hair, marks of her royal awakening that had grown more pronounced as her pregnancy progressed. She wore simple clothes now, comfortable garments that accommodated her changing body, but there was no mistaking the regal bearing that had become as natural to her as breathing. The frightened servant girl, who had once scrubbed bloodstains from stone floors, existed now only in memory, replaced by a queen who had earned the love and devotion of her people through wisdom and compassion. "The child stirs," Fenris observed from his place beside her, his massive head resting on the stone railing. The great war beast had become even more protective since learning of the pregnancy, his ancient instincts recognizing the profound importance of the life growing within her. It knows its mother stands where queens have stood for generations. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real," Lyra admitted, her voice soft with wonder, "that I went from being nobody to carrying the future of our bloodline." "You were never nobody," Fenris corrected gently. "You were simply waiting for the world to recognize what you had always been." The sound of approaching footsteps drew her from her contemplation, and she turned to see Darius emerging from their chambers with the easy smile that never failed to make her heart skip. 6 months of marriage had deepened their bond beyond anything she could have imagined, their connection so complete now that they often knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken. "The delegation from the Eastern Pax has arrived," he said, moving to stand beside her with the natural grace of a predator who had found his perfect mate. "They're requesting an audience to discuss the mutual defense treaty you proposed." "Negotiations that would have taken years of bloodshed are now resolved over breakfast conversations," Lyra mused, still marvelling at how much had changed. "Simply because we proved that strength and mercy can coexist." Darius's arm slid around her shoulders, his touch warm and reassuring as always. "Because you proved it," he corrected. "The servant girl who showed kindness to creatures everyone else feared, who chose compassion over revenge, even when she had every reason for hatred. That's the queen they all want to follow." "And the queen their children will follow after them," Fenris added, his mental voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see prophecy fulfilled. "This child will grow up in a world where worth is measured by character rather than birth, where power serves protection rather than domination." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, the baby kicked against Lyra's ribs with surprising strength. She laughed, her hand moving to soothe the restless child within her womb. "Active this morning," Darius observed, his own hand joining hers on the curve of her belly. "Already eager to meet the world it will inherit." "A world so different from the one I grew up in," Lyra said, her voice thick with emotion. "No child in our territory goes hungry now. No one is cast aside for being different or weak. The war beasts are partners rather than weapons, and our borders are secured through alliance rather than fear." "You have built what your grandmother dreamed of but never lived to see," Fenris told her, his mental voice warm with ancient pride. a kingdom where the royal bloodline serves the people rather than the reverse. The morning continued with the familiar rhythm of royal duties, but duties that felt like purpose rather than burden. The Eastern Pact delegation was welcomed with the hospitality that had become the Northern Pact's signature, their negotiations conducted over shared meals rather than informal war rooms. By midday, another alliance had been forged, another step toward the peaceful confederation that Lyra envisioned for their future. As evening approached, she found herself back on the balcony, this time with Darius beside her and a cup of herbal tea warming her hands. The baby had settled into quiet contentment, and she could feel through their mate bond that her husband shared her sense of deep satisfaction with the day's achievements. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "that night when you told me I wasn't nobody, when you said everything I believed about myself was wrong?" Darius smiled, his pale blue eyes reflecting the warmth of memory. "I remember thinking that the universe had played the most elaborate joke imaginable, the most powerful war beast in the territories, absolutely devoted to a servant girl who didn't even know her own worth." "I knew her worth," Fenris interjected, lifting his great head to fix them both with knowing amber eyes. "I was simply waiting for her to discover it herself." "And now?" Lyra asked, though she already knew the answer from the love that flowed between them through their completed bond. "Now I know that every moment of struggle, every year of waiting, every battle we fought was leading us here," Darius replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had found his destiny. "To this balcony, to this moment, to this future we're creating together." The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to bless their conversation with divine approval. In the distance, Lyra could hear the sounds of the evening meal preparation, the laughter of children playing in the compound's gardens, the contented conversations of people who felt safe and valued in their home. "I love you," she said to Darius, the words as natural as breathing now, but no less profound for their familiarity. "And I love you," he replied, his arms tightening around her with the protective devotion that had become the foundation of their rule. "My queen, my heart, my everything." "And I serve you both," Fenris added, completing the eternal triangle of loyalty that had been forged in recognition and sealed in battle. "Until the stars fall from the sky and the moon forgets to rise." As the last light faded from the western horizon, Lyra felt a profound sense of completion wash over her. The journey from worthless servant to beloved queen had been longer and stranger than any fairy tale, filled with pain and terror and moments of impossible beauty. But every step had been necessary. Every trial had taught her something essential about the kind of leader she wanted to become. She was no longer the girl who had been told she was nothing, who had scrubbed floors while dreaming of belonging somewhere somehow. She was Queen Lyra Shadowmoon, heir to the Alpha Queen bloodline, mate to the Alpha King, and mother to the future of their people. She had been shaped by suffering not to be broken by it, but to ensure that others would never have to endure what she had survived. The child in her womb kicked again, as if eager to be born into this world of peace and prosperity that their parents had built from the ashes of the old ways. And for the first time in her life, Lyra looked toward the future without fear, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The true Alpha Queen had come home at last, and she would never be lost again. The morning air carried the scent of anticipation and fear in equal measure, thick enough that even Lyra could taste it as she made her way through the compound's corridors before dawn. The Alpha King would arrive within the hour, and the entire pack buzzed with nervous energy that made her skin crawl. She had learned to navigate these moods carefully over the years, to make herself even smaller and more invisible when the pack's attention was focused elsewhere. She slipped into the arena through the servants' entrance, her arms full of fresh straw for the war beast enclosures. The creatures had been restless all night, their growls and pacing keeping half the compound awake, but as soon as Lyra appeared they began to settle. She tried not to think about what that meant, tried not to remember the way Fenris had watched her yesterday with those two intelligent eyes. The great war beast was awake, sitting perfectly still in the centre of his cage, with his massive head tilted toward the entrance, waiting. When he saw her, his ears pricked forward, and his tail gave the barest hint of a wag, a gesture so subtle that anyone else would have missed it entirely. But Lyra caught it, and something warm and dangerous bloomed in her chest. "You're not supposed to be friendly," she whispered as she approached his enclosure, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the compound stirring to life. "Everyone says you're a monster." Fenris made a sound deep in his throat, not quite a whine, but close to it. His pale gold eyes never left her face as she began spreading fresh straw in the adjoining cages, working her way closer to his massive enclosure with each passing minute. When she finally reached his cage, he pressed himself against the bars with such gentle deliberation that it took her breath away. Without thinking, Lyra reached out and touched the tip of one black ear through the steel mesh. Fenris went completely still under her touch, his eyes sliding closed as if her fingers carried some kind of magic he had been waiting his whole life to feel. The moment stretched between them, fragile and impossible, until the sound of marching feet echoed through the arena entrance. Lyra snatched her hand back and grabbed her cleaning supplies, her heart hammering against her ribs. The King's Guard, their armour gleaming even in the dim morning light, filed into the arena with military precision. Behind them came the pack's leadership, Beta Marcus walking with his chest puffed out in a display of importance that would have been laughable if Lyra hadn't been too terrified to laugh. And then he entered. King Darius filled the doorway like a force of nature, his presence so overwhelming that Lyra's knees nearly buckled. She had never seen him this close before, had only caught glimpses of him during his rare visits to the compound, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of his power. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with premature silver that only added to his authority. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath entirely, pale blue like winter ice, scanning the arena with the cold assessment of a born predator. Every wolf in the compound felt it, that crushing weight of absolute dominance that radiated from him in waves. Lyra watched as even the strongest betas dropped their heads in submission, their wolves recognizing a power so far beyond their own that resistance was unthinkable. She should have been bowing too, should have been prostrating herself on the floor like every other Omega in his presence. Instead, she found herself frozen in place beside Fenris's cage, a bucket of dirty straw water clutched in her hands, staring at the Alpha King with wide eyes that she couldn't seem to lower. There was something about him that called to a part of her she didn't understand, something that made her wolf lift its head for the first time in years. King Darius's gaze swept the arena and landed on her, those winter blue eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her obvious breach of protocol. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, they looked at each other across the space of the arena, and Lyra felt something shift deep in her chest, something that tasted like recognition. Then Beta Marcus noticed her inappropriate behaviour, and his face went white with horror. "Omega!" His voice cracked like a whip across the arena. "Submit to your king!" The words broke whatever spell had held her paralysed, and Lyra dropped to her knees so fast that water sloshed from her bucket and soaked through her worn dress. Heat blazed across her cheeks as she stared at the floor, mortified by her inexplicable behaviour. She was nobody. She was nothing. What had possessed her to think she could look directly at the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories? "Rise!" King Darius's voice was deep and commanding, but there was something in it that made her shiver. Not fear exactly, but something warmer and more dangerous. "I want to see the war beasts." Lyra scrambled to her feet and pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible as the king and his entourage moved toward the enclosures. The other war beasts began their usual display of aggression, snarling and throwing themselves against their cage doors in a show of barely contained violence that was meant to demonstrate their battle readiness. All except Fenris. The great black wolf sat perfectly still in the centre of his cage, his attention focused not on the Alpha King who had raised and trained him, but on the servant girl cowering against the far wall. King Darius stopped in front of the enclosure, his expression darkening as he took in his war beast's unprecedented behaviour. "What's wrong with him?" The king's voice carried a note of deadly calm that made everyone in the arena tense. "Why isn't he responding?" Beta Marcus cleared his throat nervously. "My lord, there have been some irregularities. The beast has been behaving strangely since yesterday, calmer than usual." "Calmer?" King Darius's eyes flicked briefly to Lyra before returning to his war beast. "Fenris doesn't do calm, he does controlled violence. There's a difference." As if summoned by the sound of his name, Fenris finally turned his attention to his master. But instead of the immediate submission that King Darius expected, the war beast's behaviour remained oddly distant, respectful but not reverential, as if his true loyalty lay elsewhere. The king's jaw tightened. "Open the cage!" "My lord!" Beta Marcus's voice rose in panic. "That might not be advisable if he's not responding normally." "I said open it." The beta fumbled with the heavy locks, his hands shaking as he worked the mechanisms that kept the most dangerous creature in the compound contained. The other pack members stepped back instinctively, giving the king room to work with his war beast, but Lyra found herself frozen in place again. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The cage door swung open with a metallic clang that echoed through the suddenly silent arena. King Darius stepped forward, his hand extended, ready to demonstrate the bond between Alpha and War Beast that made their pack's military might legendary throughout the Northern Territories. Fenris looked at the offered hand, then he looked at Lyra, and with deliberate, unmistakable intent, the great war beast turned his back on the Alpha King and padded across his cage to press himself against the bars closest to where she stood. The silence that followed was deafening. Lyra could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she watched King Darius's expression transform from confident authority to dangerous confusion. This wasn't just disobedience. This was betrayal of the highest order, a rejection of the bond that had been forged through years of training and battle. "Impossible!" Beta Marcus breathed, his face gone grey with shock. But King Darius wasn't looking at his subordinate. He was looking at Lyra, those pale blue eyes seeing her truly for the first time, seeing the way Fenris oriented himself toward her as if she were his true north, seeing the way the other war beasts had gone quiet the moment she appeared, seeing something that shouldn't exist but undeniably did. The Alpha King took a step toward her, and Lyra's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the expression on his face. It was the same look Fenris had given her yesterday, the same mixture of confusion and recognition, and something that might have been hope. "What," King Darius said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is your name?" "Lyra, my lord," she managed, the words scraping against her throat like sandpaper. "I'm nobody, just a servant." Something flickered across his features at her answer, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. But when he spoke again, there was steel in his voice that made her bones sing with recognition. "No," he said, taking another step closer, while Fenris watched approvingly from his cage. "I don't think you are." The days that followed King Darius's visit were a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances that followed Lyra wherever she went. The pack couldn't stop talking about what they had witnessed in the arena, the impossible moment when the most feared war beast in the Northern Territories had chosen a servant girl over the Alpha King himself. But no one knew what to do with that information, so they did what packs always did when faced with something that challenged their understanding of the world. They watched, and they waited. Lyra tried to return to her normal routine, cleaning the compound and tending to her duties with the same invisible efficiency she had always maintained. But everything felt different now, charged with an undercurrent of anticipation that made her skin crawl. The other pack members no longer ignored her completely, but their new attention felt more dangerous than their previous indifference. She caught them studying her when they thought she wasn't looking, their expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion to something that might have been fear. It was the fear that worried her most. Fenris had not improved since the king's departure. If anything, his fixation on her had grown stronger, more obvious to anyone who cared to look. The handlers assigned to feed him reported that he would not eat unless Lyra was present, would not respond to commands from anyone else. He spent his days pressed against the front bars of his cage, those pale gold eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that made even the bravest warriors uncomfortable. "It's unnatural," she heard one of the betas mutter as she passed through the dining hall. "War beasts don't form attachments to servants. They're weapons, not pets." "Maybe she's using some kind of magic on him," another voice suggested, the words carrying clearly across the room despite the attempt at discretion. There were stories about witches who could control animals with their voices. Lyra kept her head down and continued toward the servants' quarters, but she could feel the weight of their speculation pressing against her shoulders like a physical thing, magic, as if she possessed anything more mystical than an ability to scrub bloodstains from stone floors, as if someone with her complete lack of worth could command the loyalty of a creature that had been bred for war. But as she lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the sounds of the compound settling into uneasy sleep, she couldn't shake the memory of Fenris's reaction to her touch, the way he had gone still under her fingers, as if her presence brought him a peace he had never known, the way all the war beasts had quieted when she hummed that strange melody she couldn't remember learning, the way King Darius had looked at her with those winter blue eyes and told her she wasn't nobody. Sleep eluded her, and eventually she gave up trying. The compound was quiet at this hour, most of the pack lost in dreams of glory and dominance. Lyra slipped from her bed and padded barefoot through the corridors, her destination unclear even to herself. She just needed to move, to do something other than lie in the darkness and wonder if her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. Her feet carried her to the arena without conscious decision. The war beast enclosures were dimly lit by torches that burned through the night, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. Most of the creatures were asleep, their breathing deep and steady, but Fenris was awake and waiting. He always seemed to be waiting. "You're going to get me in trouble," Lyra whispered as she approached his cage, though she couldn't bring herself to stay away. "Everyone's talking about us. They think I've done something to you." Fenris made that soft sound in his throat again, the one that was almost a whine, but somehow conveyed more emotion than any human words could have managed. He pressed himself against the bars with such deliberate gentleness that her heart ached in response. "I don't understand what's happening," she continued, her voice barely audible in the quiet space. "I've never been special. I've never been anything. But when you look at me like that, I almost believe I could be." The melody began without her conscious permission, that wordless tune that seemed to rise from some deep place in her chest. She had been humming it her whole life without really noticing, the way some people breathe or blink. But now, in the hushed darkness of the arena, it seemed to carry more weight, more meaning. The effect on the war beasts was immediate and profound. Every creature in the enclosures stirred, drawn from sleep by the sound of her voice. But instead of the usual snarls and displays of aggression, they moved with purpose toward the front of their cages, their eyes fixed on her with expressions that looked almost human, almost reverent. Fenris began to harmonize with her, his voice a deep rumble that somehow matched the melody perfectly. The sound of it raised goosebumps along her arms, a harmony so natural and right that it felt like coming home. Other beasts joined in, their voices blending into something that was more than music, more than simple sound. It was a song of recognition, of ancient bloodlines and forgotten loyalties, of something that had been lost and was now, impossibly, being found. Lyra's voice trailed off as the full impact of what she was hearing settled over her. This wasn't just her humming a lullaby anymore. This was a chorus of war beasts treating her like she was something sacred, something worthy of the kind of respect they had never shown to anyone except their true alpha queen. The voice from the darkness made her jump, her heart slamming against her ribs as she spun around to find King Darius standing at the arena entrance. He moved with perfect silence, a predator's grace that allowed him to appear and disappear like a ghost when it suited him. His pale eyes reflected the torchlight as he stepped into the flickering circle of illumination, and Lyra realized with growing panic that he had been watching her for who knew how long. "My lord," she breathed, dropping into the deepest curtsy she could manage. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb." "Don't." His voice cut through her stammered apology with quiet authority. "Don't apologize for something you can't help." He moved closer, and Lyra fought the urge to back away as his presence filled the space around her. This close, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of responsibility that carved lines around his eyes. But there was something else there too, something that looked like wonder. "That song," he said, his gaze never leaving her face. "Where did you learn it?" "I don't know," Lyra admitted, the truth spilling out before she could think to lie. "I've always known it. It just comes to me sometimes." King Darius was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the shadows. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something she couldn't quite identify. "My mother used to sing that song to me when I was very small," he said. "Before she died. She told me it was the lullaby of the Alpha Queens, passed down through the royal bloodline for 1,000 years. A song that only those born to rule could truly understand." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and reeling. Royal bloodline, Alpha Queens. It was impossible. She was nobody, had always been nobody, would always be. "But that's impossible," she whispered, voicing her thoughts before she could stop herself. "I'm just a servant. I have no family, no bloodline. I'm nothing." King Darius took another step closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but implacable, carrying the kind of certainty that could move mountains. "Lyra," he said, and the way he spoke her name made something deep inside her chest flutter to life. "I think you're about to discover that everything you believe about yourself is wrong." Behind them, Fenris watched from his cage with those knowing amber eyes, and for the first time in her life, Lyra began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had never been as worthless as everyone had told her she was. Maybe she had simply been waiting for someone to recognize what she truly was. Morning arrived with cruel efficiency, bringing with it a summons that Lyra had been dreading since the moment King Darius had walked away from their midnight encounter. Beta Marcus stood in the doorway of the servants' quarters, his face grim with the kind of barely controlled panic that meant someone important was unhappy about something. "You," he said, pointing at Lyra with a trembling finger. "The king wants to see you in the war beast enclosures. Now." The other servants scattered like leaves in a windstorm, suddenly finding urgent tasks that required their immediate attention elsewhere. Lyra couldn't blame them. When the pack leadership singled someone out for special attention, it rarely ended well for the person in question. She had spent her entire life being invisible specifically to avoid moments like this. But there was no avoiding it now. The walk to the arena felt like a funeral march, each step bringing her closer to whatever fate awaited her. Beta Marcus maintained his distance, as if her newfound notoriety might be contagious, and Lyra found herself wondering if this was how condemned prisoners felt on their way to execution. Her stomach churned with a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. King Darius was waiting for her beside Fenris's enclosure, his expression unreadable in the morning light. He looked like he hadn't slept, the shadows under his eyes deeper than they had been the night before. When he saw her approach, something flickered across his features that might have been relief. Lyra. The way he said her name still did strange things to her pulse. Thank you for coming. As if she'd had a choice, as if anyone in the pack would dare refuse a direct summons from the Alpha King. But there was something in his tone that suggested he understood the courage it had taken for her to walk into this situation, even though she'd had no alternative. "My lord," she replied, dropping into what she hoped was an appropriate curtsy. The formal gestures still felt awkward on her, like clothes that didn't quite fit. King Darius studied her for a long moment, and Lyra found herself caught between the urge to look away and the inexplicable need to meet his gaze directly. There was something different about the way he looked at her now, as if the conversation they'd had in the darkness had fundamentally altered his perception of who and what she was. "We have a problem," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was accustomed to solving impossible situations. "Fenris won't respond to any of his handlers. He won't eat, won't train, won't even acknowledge their existence. The other war beasts are following his lead, becoming increasingly unmanageable." Lyra glanced toward the enclosures, where she could see several frustrated handlers standing outside the cages, looking lost and increasingly desperate. The beasts inside were indeed restless, pacing and growling with an energy that seemed barely contained. All except Fenris, who sat perfectly still in the centre of his cage, watching her with those two intelligent amber eyes. "I don't understand what you want from me, my lord," Lyra said, though she was beginning to suspect exactly what he was going to ask. The thought terrified her. "I want you to try handling him." The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of possibility and danger in all directions. "Just temporarily, until we can figure out what's causing this behavioural change." Beta Marcus made a strangled sound of protest. "My lord, with all due respect, she's just a servant. She has no training, no experience with combat animals. If something goes wrong—" "Then it goes wrong," King Darius cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "But right now, Fenris is useless to us. Worse than useless, actually, because his behaviour is affecting the entire War Beast programme. We're supposed to march to war within the month, and I can't do that with animals that won't obey their handlers." War. The word hit Lyra like a physical blow. She had known something was building, had sensed the increasing tension in the compound, but hearing it stated so bluntly made everything suddenly, terrifyingly real. These creatures weren't just weapons in the abstract. They were tools that would be used to kill and be killed, and somehow she had become entangled in that machinery. "I don't know how," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've never trained anything. I don't know the commands or the techniques or—" "You don't need to know them." King Darius's interruption was gentle but firm. "Whatever you're doing, it's working better than anything we've tried. I need you to trust that, even if you don't understand it." Trust. As if she had ever been in a position where her trust mattered to anyone. As if her opinion or comfort or fear had ever been factors worth considering in the pack's decision-making process. But when King Darius looked at her with those winter blue eyes, she found herself wanting to believe that maybe this time was different. "What if I can't control him?" she asked. "What if he hurts someone?" "He won't." The certainty in his voice was absolute, unshakable. "Whatever else is happening here, Fenris isn't going to hurt you. I'd stake my life on it." Lyra looked toward the massive war beast, who continued to watch their conversation with an attention that seemed almost human. There was something in his posture, in the way he held himself, that spoke of patience and gentleness held in careful check, as if he were waiting for her to understand something that should have been obvious. "All right," she heard herself say, though she couldn't quite believe the words were coming from her mouth. "I'll try." The relief that crossed King Darius's face was so profound that it took her breath away. For just a moment, he looked less like an untouchable Alpha King and more like a man who had been carrying an impossible burden alone. Beta Marcus fumbled with the cage locks, his hands shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to get the mechanism to work. The other handlers retreated to what they obviously considered a safe distance, leaving Lyra standing alone before the open door of Fenris's enclosure. The great war beast rose to his feet with fluid grace, his massive form filling the cage doorway. Up close, he was even more intimidating than she had realized, easily capable of tearing her apart without effort. But as she looked into those amber eyes, all she saw was recognition, welcome, as if she were finally coming home. "Hello," she whispered, extending one trembling hand toward him. Fenris stepped forward and gently pressed his enormous head into her palm, his eyes sliding closed with what could only be described as bliss. The moment their skin made contact, something electric passed between them, a connection that felt older than memory and stronger than fear. And suddenly, impossibly, she could hear his voice in her mind. Finally, the voice was warm and patient, tinged with what sounded like affection. "I was beginning to think you would never understand," Lyra gasped, nearly jerking her hand away before Fenris pressed closer, keeping the contact between them steady. "Don't be afraid," he continued, his mental voice as clear as if he were speaking aloud. "This is what you were born for, what we were both born for." "I can hear you," she breathed, not caring that the watching handlers would think she was talking to herself. "You're talking to me. I have been trying to talk to you since the moment you first walked into this place," Fenris replied, and she could sense his amusement rippling through their connection. "You simply weren't ready to listen." The other war beasts had gone completely silent, every one of them pressed against the front bars of their cages, watching the unprecedented display with what could only be called reverence. King Darius took a step closer, his expression shifting from relief to something that looked like awe. "Lyra," he said softly, "what's happening?" She turned to look at him, her hand still resting against Fenris's massive head, and for the first time in her life she felt powerful, not just useful or tolerated, but genuinely, undeniably powerful. "He's been waiting for me," she said, the words carrying a certainty that surprised her. "They all have. I think they know something about me that I'm only just beginning to understand." King Darius nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then perhaps," he said, his voice carrying the weight of destiny, "it's time you learned what that something is." The melody came to her without warning 3 days later, rising from some deep place in her chest as she groomed Fenris in the quiet hour before dawn. It was the same wordless tune she had hummed her entire life, but now it felt different somehow, more complete, as if the missing pieces of an ancient puzzle were finally falling into place. Fenris lifted his massive head as the first notes spilled from her lips, his amber eyes growing distant with what looked like recognition. Around them, the other war beasts stirred in their enclosures, drawn from sleep by the haunting beauty of the sound. But it was the gasp from the arena entrance that made Lyra's voice falter and die in her throat. Old Henrik stood frozen in the doorway, his weathered face gone pale as winter bone. The pack's eldest member, keeper of their histories and guardian of their traditions, stared at Lyra with an expression of shock so profound that it bordered on reverence. His gnarled hands trembled as he gripped his walking staff, and when he tried to speak, no sound emerged. "Henrik?" Lyra set down her brush and rose slowly to her feet, alarmed by the old man's obvious distress. "Are you unwell? Should I fetch someone?" The elder's mouth worked soundlessly for several moments before he managed to force out a single trembling word. "Impossible." Fenris pressed closer to Lyra's side, offering his solid warmth as support, while his mental voice whispered reassurance through their bond. "He knows," the war beast said simply. "The old one remembers what the others have forgotten." "Remembers what?" Lyra whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was asking Fenris or Henrik. The old man took a halting step forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "That song," he said, his voice cracking with age and emotion. "Child, where did you learn that song?" "I don't know," Lyra replied, the familiar answer feeling increasingly inadequate. "I've always known it. It just comes to me sometimes." Henrik's legs gave out, and he sank onto a nearby bench with the heavy finality of someone whose entire world-view had just been shattered. "Blessed ancestors preserve us," he muttered, his hands shaking as he pressed them against his temples. "After all these years, after we thought the line was lost forever." "What line?" The question burst from Lyra before she could stop it, her newfound connection with Fenris giving her a confidence she had never possessed before. "What are you talking about?" The elder looked up at her, and there were tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "The lullaby of the silver moon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The song that was sung to the royal children of the Alpha Queen bloodline. The melody that died with the last of the true queens 30 years ago." The world seemed to tilt sideways, and Lyra felt Fenris steady her with his shoulder as her knees threatened to buckle. Royal bloodline. Alpha Queen. The same words King Darius had spoken to her in the darkness, but hearing them from Henrik's lips somehow made them more real, more terrifying. "That's impossible," she breathed, echoing the old man's earlier words. "I'm nobody. I have no family, no history. I was found abandoned at the gates as a child." Henrik's laugh was bitter and broken. Abandoned, yes, but not by accident. He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his staff as he approached her with the careful reverence one might show a sacred relic. "The Shadow Moon Massacre, 30 years past. The old Alpha King's rivals thought they had wiped out the entire royal line, killed every last descendant who might challenge their claim to power." The words hit Lyra like physical blows, each one reshaping her understanding of who and what she was. "But I survived." "Someone hid you," Henrik confirmed, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Someone who loved you enough to sacrifice everything to keep you safe. They suppressed your wolf, masked your scent, stole away every marker that might identify you as royal blood. They made you invisible, child, because invisible was the only way to keep you alive." "Tell him about the dreams," Fenris urged through their mental connection. "Tell him about the woman with silver hair who sang to you in your sleep." "I have dreams sometimes," Lyra said slowly, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "A woman with silver hair who holds me while I cry. She sings this song, but in my dreams it has words I can never remember when I wake up." Henrik's breath caught, and he reached out with one trembling hand as if to touch her face before catching himself. "Queen Serena," he whispered, "your grandmother, she was the last of the true Alpha Queens before the massacre. They say she had the gift of prophecy, could speak with the ancient spirits." The name resonated through Lyra's bones like a bell being struck, awakening memories that felt older than her conscious mind. Images flashed behind her eyes. A woman with silver hair and eyes like moonlight, strong arms holding her close, a voice like honey and starlight singing words of love and protection. "You are remembering," Fenris observed, his mental voice warm with approval. "The barriers they placed in your mind are weakening. Soon you will know the truth of what you are." "But why now?" Lyra asked, looking between Henrik and her bonded war beast. "Why is this happening now after all these years?" "Because," a new voice said from the arena entrance, You've finally reached the age where your true nature cannot be suppressed any longer." King Darius stepped into the morning light, his presence filling the space with that familiar, overwhelming authority. But when he looked at Lyra now, there was something different in his expression. Something that looked like recognition and wonder, and a deeper emotion that made her heart race. "Your Majesty," Henrik began, struggling to bow despite his obvious shock. "I heard everything," King Darius said, waving off the formal gesture. "The barriers are breaking down, aren't they? Her wolf is trying to emerge despite the suppression magic." "The dreams are getting stronger," Lyra admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wake up feeling like there's something trapped inside me, trying to break free." King Darius nodded grimly. "That's why Fenris recognized you. War beasts can sense royal blood even when it's hidden. They're drawn to true alpha power like iron filings to a lodestone." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Fenris pressed his great head against Lyra's hand, his mental voice carrying a note of protective fierceness. "She is in danger," he told her. "There are those who still seek to destroy the royal line. They will sense her awakening power soon, if they have not already." "What does this mean?" Lyra asked, looking between the three males who seemed to understand far more about her situation than she did. "What am I supposed to do with this information?" King Darius took a step closer, and Lyra caught a hint of his scent, wild and clean like pine forests and winter storms. "It means," he said, his voice carrying the weight of destiny, "that everything is about to change, for all of us." Henrik bowed his head respectfully. "The bloodline lives," he murmured, the words carrying the weight of prayer. "After 30 years of darkness, the true Alpha Queen has returned." Somewhere in the distance, a horn sounded the call to morning training, but none of them moved. They stood frozen in the moment of revelation, surrounded by war beasts who watched with ancient knowing in their eyes, while the last heir to a murdered dynasty struggled to understand what her survival meant for the future of them all. "You are not alone," Fenris reminded her, his mental voice steady and sure. "You never were. We have all been waiting for you to remember who you truly are." And for the first time in her life, as the weight of her true heritage settled around her shoulders like a cloak, Lyra began to believe that maybe she was worth waiting for. The attack came at feeding time, when Lyra was most vulnerable and alone with the war beasts. It had been carefully planned, Elena realized later, timed to coincide with the moment when Fenris would be at his most unpredictable, driven by hunger and the primal need to hunt. What Elena hadn't counted on was how completely her understanding of the great war beast had been wrong. Lyra entered Fenris's enclosure, carrying the massive haunch of meat that served as his daily ration, her movements confident now after a week of working with him. The bond between them had grown stronger each day, their telepathic connection deepening until she could sense his moods and needs as easily as her own. He no longer seemed like a weapon to her, but rather like the loyal guardian he had always been meant to be. "Something is wrong," Fenris warned, his mental voice carrying a note of tension that made Lyra pause just inside the cage door. "I smell deception. Betrayal." "What do you mean?" she whispered, setting down the meat and scanning the area around the enclosures. Everything looked normal, the usual handlers going about their duties with practiced efficiency. But now that Fenris had drawn her attention to it, she could sense something off in the atmosphere, a subtle wrongness that made her skin crawl. "The female who hates you," Fenris continued, his amber eyes fixed on something beyond Lyra's line of sight. "She has been planning. I can smell her anger, her fear. She believes you threaten her position." Asterisk Elena. Of course it would be Elena, the Beta's daughter, who had expected to catch King Darius's attention through her beauty and political connections. The same Elena who had watched with growing fury as Lyra's bond with the war beasts elevated her from invisible servant to someone worthy of the Alpha King's personal interest. "She wouldn't dare," Lyra said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were foolish. Elena would dare anything if she thought it would eliminate the competition for the throne she believed was rightfully hers. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the arena, multiple sets moving with the coordinated purpose of a planned operation. Lyra's heart began to race as she recognized the voices of Elena's closest allies, young betas who shared her resentment of the pack's changing dynamics. "They mean to make your death look accidental," Fenris informed her, his massive body going tense with predatory focus. "They have weakened my restraints, expecting me to kill you in a feeding frenzy. When they find your body, they will say the beast finally turned on his handler." The cage door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoing with a finality that made her blood run cold. She spun around to see Elena standing outside the enclosure, a keyring dangling from her fingers and a smile of savage satisfaction on her beautiful face. "How tragic," Elena said, her voice carrying full sympathy for the benefit of her accomplices. "Poor little Lyra, thinking she could handle a war beast without proper training. I warned everyone this would happen eventually." "Let me out," Lyra demanded, though her voice came out smaller and more frightened than she had intended. "Eleanor, please, you don't have to do this." "Oh, but I do." Eleanor's mask of false concern slipped, revealing the hatred that had been festering beneath her perfect surface. "You think you can just appear from nowhere and steal what's mine? The Alpha King was supposed to choose me. I've spent years preparing for that role, years earning my place at his side." "She speaks of you as if you were a rival for a trinket," Fenris observed, his mental voice carrying a note of offended dignity. "She does not understand that you are not competition. You are destiny." The other betas spread out around the enclosure, their positioning clearly rehearsed. They carried weapons, Lyra realized with growing horror. Not the standard training gear, but real blades designed for killing. They meant to make sure she was dead before Fenris could be blamed for her murder. "You're making a mistake," Lyra said, backing toward the center of the cage where Fenris waited with predatory stillness. "The king won't believe your story. He'll know you're responsible." Eleanor laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Willie? A servant girl dead in a war beast's cage, killed by the very creature she thought she could tame. It's the most natural thing in the world. Tragic, but hardly unexpected." "They underestimate us both," Fenris told her, his mental voice carrying a note of grim amusement. "They see only what they wish to see, a weak girl and an uncontrolled beast. They do not see an Alpha Queen and her sworn guardian." The first attacker stepped forward, his blade gleaming in the torchlight. "Make it quick," Elena ordered. "We need to be gone before anyone discovers what happened." That was when Fenris moved. The great war beast exploded into motion with a speed and violence that defied comprehension. The supposedly weakened restraint snapped like spider silk as he launched himself toward the cage door with a roar that shook dust from the stone walls. But instead of attacking Lyra as Elena had planned, he positioned himself between her and the armed betas, his massive form radiating protective fury. "Now you see what I truly am," he told Lyra as chaos erupted around them. "Not a weapon to be used, but a guardian sworn to defend the royal blood until my dying breath." Elena's carefully laid plans crumbled as her accomplices found themselves facing not a mad beast, but a creature fighting with the focused intelligence of a sworn protector. Fenris's attacks were precise, calculated to disable rather than kill, driving the attackers back from the cage while keeping himself between them and Lyra at all times. "Impossible," Elena breathed, her face going pale as she watched her assassination attempt fall apart. "He's supposed to be uncontrollable. He's supposed to protect me," Lyra finished, her voice carrying a new note of authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "Because that's what he was born to do." The words seemed to unlock something within her, a power that had been building since the moment Henrik had revealed her true heritage. She felt her consciousness expand, touching the minds of every war beast in the compound, calling to them with an authority that bypassed all their training. They answered. The sound of splintering wood and twisted metal filled the arena as cage after cage burst open, freed by war beasts who suddenly remembered their true purpose. They poured into the space with deadly precision, surrounding Elena's group with a circle of fangs and claws and ancient loyalty. But they didn't attack. They simply waited, looking to Lyra for the command that would determine the fate of those who had dared threaten their true Alpha Queen. "You were wrong about one thing," Lyra said, stepping forward to stand beside Fenris with a confidence she had never felt before. "I'm not trying to steal anything from you, Elena. I'm simply taking back what was always mine." Elena's composure finally cracked entirely, fear replacing the arrogance that had driven her to this desperate gamble. "You're nobody," she whispered, the words carrying all the hatred and desperation of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse. "You're nothing but a servant who got lucky." "Tell her," Fenris urged, his mental voice warm with pride. "Tell her what you are." Lyra straightened, feeling the weight of her true heritage settling around her like armour. "I am Lyra Shadowmoon," she said, her voice carrying the authority of generations of royal blood. "Granddaughter of Queen Serena, last of the Alpha Queen bloodline, and you have just committed treason against the crown." The words echoed through the arena like a pronouncement of fate, and Elena's face went white as bone as the full magnitude of her mistake became clear. In the distance, the sound of running footsteps announced the arrival of the pack leadership, drawn by the sounds of conflict. But it was too late for Elena's plans and too late for her desperate gamble. The true Alpha Queen had awakened, and she would not be easily destroyed. King Darius arrived at the arena like the wrath of the ancient gods, his presence so overwhelming that even the liberated war beasts pressed themselves low to the ground in instinctive submission. The sound of his approach had been thunder and steel, the entire pack guard moving with him as word of the disturbance spread through the compound like wildfire. But when he saw the scene before him, when he took in Elena surrounded by armed conspirators and Lyra standing at the centre of a circle of freed war beasts, his expression shifted from concern to something far more dangerous, absolute fury. "Explain," he commanded, the single word carrying enough authority to make the stone walls seem to tremble. "Now." Elena scrambled to find her voice, her earlier confidence completely shattered by the spectacular failure of her assassination attempt. "My lord, there was an accident. The servant girl was attacked by the war beast, and we tried to help." "Enough." King Darius's interruption was quiet, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he had shouted. "I can smell the lies on you, Elena. I can smell the premeditation, the planning, the weapons that were drawn with intent to kill." His pale blue eyes swept the arena, taking in every detail with the cold precision of a predator evaluating a kill zone. The broken cage locks, the positioning of Elena's accomplices, the way the war beasts had arranged themselves in perfect defensive formation around Lyra. When his gaze finally settled on her, standing tall and proud beside Fenris with her chin raised in defiance, something fundamental shifted in his expression. Recognition, not just of her face or her presence, but of what she truly was. "You tried to kill her," he said, his voice carrying a note of incredulous rage. "You tried to murder the last surviving heir of the Alpha Queen bloodline." Elena's face went grey as ash. "My lord, I don't know what lies she's been telling you, but she's just a servant. She has no bloodline, no heritage." "She has the song of the silver moon," King Darius cut her off, stepping closer to where Lyra stood with regal composure. "She can command war beasts with a thought. She carries the scent markers of royal blood, despite 30 years of suppression magic. And you, in your jealousy and stupidity, tried to destroy the most precious thing our people possess." "He knows," Fenris observed through their mental connection, his voice warm with approval. "He has always known. He was simply waiting for you to understand it yourself." "Is it true?" King Darius asked, addressing Lyra directly for the first time since entering the arena. "Are you ready to claim what is yours by right of birth?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with the destiny of bloodlines and the future of the pack. Lyra felt the eyes of every person in the arena fixed on her, waiting for an answer that would reshape everything they thought they knew about power and legitimacy and worth. "I am Lyra Shadowmoon," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had been sleeping in her bones for 23 years. "Granddaughter of Queen Serena, heir to the Alpha Queen bloodline, and I claim my birthright." The words seemed to resonate through the very stones of the compound, awakening something ancient and powerful that had been dormant since the night of the massacre. King Darius dropped to one knee before her, the gesture so unexpected that gasps echoed through the gathered crowd. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying reverence and something deeper, something that sounded like relief. "I have been waiting for you." The formal recognition sent shockwaves through the watching pack members. Beta Marcus looked like he might faint, his worldview crumbling as he watched the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories kneel before the girl he had spent years dismissing as worthless. The other betas began dropping to their knees one by one, following their king's lead even as their minds struggled to process what was happening. Elena remained standing, her beautiful face twisted with hatred and disbelief. "This is insane," she snarled, her composure finally cracking entirely. "You're going to destroy everything for some servant girl with delusions of grandeur. I am the beta's daughter. I am the rightful choice for your queen." King Darius rose slowly, his movement predatory and deliberate. "You are a traitor who attempted regicide," he said, his voice carrying the finality of judgment. "You plotted to murder the true heir to the throne, and you conspired to frame an innocent war beast for your crime. By the ancient laws, your life is forfeit." "No." Elena backed away, her eyes wild with panic. "You can't do this. My father—" "Your father will disown you before sundown, assuming I allow him to live after learning of his daughter's treason." King Darius's words were ice and steel, promising justice that would be swift and absolute. "You have betrayed not just your Alpha King, but the sacred bloodline that founded our people." Lyra watched the exchange with growing confidence, feeling her power settle around her like a cloak that finally fit properly. The war beasts remained at her command, their ancient loyalty awakened by the presence of true royalty. She could feel their devotion like warmth in her chest, could sense their readiness to defend her against any threat. "You are no longer the frightened girl who scrubbed floors," Fenris observed, his mental voice filled with pride. "You are becoming who you were always meant to be." "Eleanor," Lyra said, stepping forward with regal grace, "you were wrong about one thing. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I never was. You cannot steal what was never yours to begin with." The beta's daughter looked at her with undisguised hatred, but beneath that emotion Lyra could see fear. Fear of a world where bloodline and destiny mattered more than political manoeuvring. Fear of a power she could never hope to match or manipulate. "The king will tire of you," Elena spat, making one last desperate attempt to salvage her position. "When the novelty wears off, when you prove you can't rule, he'll remember what true nobility looks like." King Darius moved faster than thought, crossing the distance between them in a single fluid motion. His hand closed around Elena's throat, not tight enough to kill, but firm enough to make his point crystal clear. "Speak of her with disrespect again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I will forget that we were ever allies. The Queen's honour is my honour now." "The Queen," Fenris repeated, his mental voice warm with satisfaction. "He named you Queen before the entire pack. The bond between you grows stronger." Elena's eyes widened as the full implications of King Darius's words sank in. Not just recognition of bloodline, but personal claim. Not just political alliance, but something deeper and more binding. King Darius released her and stepped back, his attention returning to Lyra with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Your Majesty," he said, offering her his arm with formal courtesy. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." Lyra accepted his escort with natural grace, feeling the rightness of their partnership settle into her bones. As they walked toward the arena exit, the war beasts fell into formation around them, a living honor guard that proclaimed her status more clearly than any crown could have managed. Behind them, Eleanor watched their departure with the bitter knowledge that her world had irrevocably changed. The servant girl she had tried to destroy was now her queen, protected by the most powerful alpha in the territories and bonded to creatures that would die before allowing her to be harmed, and there was nothing Eleanor could do to change it. "You are home," Fenris told Lyra as they walked through corridors that no longer felt like a prison. Finally, truly home. For the first time in her life, Lyra believed it might be true. The ancient ritual chamber lay deep beneath the compound, carved from living stone in an age when the first Alpha Kings ruled with the blessing of the moon goddess herself. Lyra had never known it existed, had never imagined that such sacred spaces could be hidden beneath the everyday world of training grounds and servant quarters. Now, as she descended the worn steps with King Darius at her side and Henrik leading the way, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. "The awakening chamber," Henrik explained, his voice hushed with reverence as he lit torches that had not burned in 30 years. "Here, the royal children underwent the ritual to unlock their true power. Your grandmother was the last to walk these stones." The chamber itself took Lyra's breath away. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight, depicting scenes of transformation and triumph from the earliest days of their people. At the centre of the space stood a raised dais surrounded by channels carved deep into the stone, designed to channel the ancient magics that would strip away the barriers hiding her true nature. "Are you afraid?" Fenris asked through their mental connection. The great war beast had been granted the unprecedented honour of witnessing the ritual, his presence a recognition of his role as her sworn guardian. "Terrified," Lyra admitted aloud, not caring that King Darius could hear her confession. There was no point in pretending to be braver than she felt, not when she was about to undergo a transformation that might fundamentally change who she was. "Good," King Darius said, his voice gentle despite the gravity of the moment. "Fear means you understand what's at stake. Fear means you're taking this seriously." Henrik began arranging ancient ceremonial implements around the dais, his movements precise with the memory of rituals he had witnessed in his youth. "The suppression magic that hides your wolf was woven deep into your very bones as a child," he explained. "It saved your life, but now it must be unravelled completely. The process will be intense." "Painful," Fenris corrected bluntly. "Do not lie to her, old man. She deserves to know the truth." "It will hurt," Henrik acknowledged with a nod toward the war beast. "The barriers were never meant to be permanent, but 30 years of suppression has made them part of your very essence. Breaking them will feel like breaking yourself." Lyra stepped onto the dais with trembling legs, feeling the ancient power of the place seeping into her bones. The stone was warm beneath her feet, as if heated by some internal fire that had burned since the foundation of their people. When she looked up at the carved ceiling, she could see constellations mapped in precious metals, the same stars that had guided her ancestors to greatness. "Will I still be me?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her since the moment she learned of her heritage. "After the awakening, will I still be the person you both care about?" King Darius stepped closer, his presence steady and reassuring, despite the otherworldly atmosphere of the chamber. "You will be more yourself than you have ever been," he promised, the girl who scrubbed floors with quiet dignity, who showed kindness to creatures everyone else feared, who hummed lullabies without knowing their power. That person is the true you. The awakening will simply give you the strength to protect what you love. "He speaks truth," Fenris confirmed. "Your heart will remain unchanged. Only your power will grow." Henrik began the incantation, his voice rising and falling in rhythms older than memory. The words were in the ancient tongue, the sacred language that had been spoken by the first Alpha Queens when the world was young. As the syllables echoed through the chamber, Lyra felt something deep within her chest beginning to stir. The pain started slowly, a warmth that spread through her bones like liquid fire. At first it was almost pleasant, like sinking into a hot bath after a day of hard labour. But as Henrik's voice grew stronger and the ancient magic began to work, the warmth became heat, and the heat became agony. "I am here," Fenris reminded her as she gasped and doubled over. "You are not alone in this." The suppression barriers that had protected her for so long fought against their dissolution, clinging to her essence like thorns embedded in flesh. Each layer that peeled away brought fresh waves of pain that left her breathless and shaking. But beneath the agony, she could feel something else awakening. Something powerful and ancient and right. Her wolf. The creature that had been sleeping in the depths of her soul for 23 years stirred to life with a howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chamber. But this was not the weak, whimpering thing she had always sensed within herself. This was something magnificent, something that blazed with the silver light of royal blood and ancient power. "Hold on," King Darius urged, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "Just a little longer." The transformation hit her like lightning striking stone. Pain lanced through every bone as they cracked and reformed, as her spine elongated and her face pushed forward into a muzzle. She heard herself scream, but the sound came out as a howl, long and mournful and filled with the rage of 3 decades of suppression. But when the agony finally began to fade, when the last of the barriers cracked and fell away like shed skin, Lyra felt herself truly for the first time in her life. Her wolf form was magnificent, silver-white fur gleaming like starlight, easily matching Fenris in size and presence. Ancient pack markings traced themselves across her coat in lines of deeper silver, symbols of royal bloodline that had not been seen since her grandmother's time. When she lifted her head, her eyes blazed with power that made even the torches seem dim by comparison. "My queen," Fenris said, his mental voice filled with awe and devotion. "You are everything the prophecies promised and more." Around the chamber, every surface seemed to respond to her presence. The carved walls pulsed with soft light, the metallic constellations overhead blazed like real stars, and the very air hummed with power that recognized and welcomed her awakening. King Darius knelt before her wolf form, his head bowed in reverence. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "welcome home." Henrik wept openly, his ancient face streaming with tears of joy and relief. "The bloodline lives," he whispered. "After 30 years of darkness, the true Alpha Queen has returned to us." Lyra shifted back to human form, with fluid grace, the transformation as natural as breathing now that the barriers were gone. But she was changed, marked by power that blazed in her eyes and sang in her blood. The timid servant girl was gone forever, replaced by someone who could command respect from war beasts and alphas alike. "You are ready," Fenris told her, "ready to face whatever challenges await us." "Yes," she agreed, her voice carrying new authority even in its quietness. "I am." The awakening was complete. The last Alpha Queen had reclaimed her throne, and the world would never be the same. The dawn attack came without warning, a coordinated assault from the Blood Moon pack that struck the compound with devastating precision. Lyra woke to the sound of battle horns and the acrid smell of smoke, her newly awakened senses immediately cataloguing the chaos erupting throughout the territory. Enemy wolves had breached the outer defences under cover of darkness, their assault timed to catch the northern pack at their most vulnerable. King Darius was already moving, his warrior instincts honed by years of warfare. "They're targeting the armory and the communications tower," he said, pulling on his armor with practiced efficiency. "This isn't a random raid. Someone gave them intelligence about our defenses." "The female who tried to kill you," Fenris observed through their mental connection, his voice dark with understanding. "Her exile was recent. She would have had time to reach our enemies, to trade secrets for revenge. Elena, even banished and disgraced, she had found one final way to strike at the pack that had rejected her." Lyra felt a cold fury settle in her chest as she realized the scope of her former rival's betrayal. It wasn't enough to try to murder the rightful queen. Now she was willing to see their entire people destroyed. "I have to get to the war beast compounds," King Darius continued, checking his weapons with grim determination. "If the enemy takes control of our own beasts, we'll be fighting a war on two fronts." "Then that's where I need to be too," Lyra said, her voice carrying new authority. "The war beasts will respond to me better than anyone else now." King Darius paused, his pale blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Lyra, you've only just awakened. Your power is still settling, still finding its balance. I can't ask you to risk—" "You're not asking," she interrupted, drawing on reserves of confidence she had never known she possessed. "I'm telling you, those creatures are my responsibility now, my burden to bear. I won't hide in safety while my people fight for their lives." "She speaks truth," Fenris confirmed, pressing his massive head against her hand. "The beasts will fight harder for their true queen than for any battle commander. Our loyalty runs deeper than training or fear." The journey to the war beast compounds was a nightmare of smoke and screaming, enemy wolves appearing from the shadows to strike at anyone who looked important enough to be worth killing. But with Fenris at her side and her awakened power singing through her veins, Lyra moved through the chaos like a force of nature. Her telepathic connection to the war beasts allowed her to coordinate their movements even from a distance, turning confused animals into a disciplined fighting force. When they reached the compounds, the situation was worse than she had feared. The enemy had managed to breach several enclosures, releasing war beasts that they hoped to turn against their former masters. But without proper handlers, the creatures were running wild, attacking friend and foe alike in their confusion and fear. "Fenris!" King Darius commanded, falling back on old training as explosions rocked the area around them. "Protect the queen, keep her safe no matter what happens." The great war beast turned to look at his former master, amber eyes reflecting an ancient wisdom that had been awakened along with Lyra's power. "No," he said simply, his mental voice carrying to both of them. "My loyalty is not yours to command anymore. It belongs to her, and her alone." King Darius went very still, the implications of Fenris's words settling over him like a physical weight. This wasn't just about battlefield tactics or military strategy. This was about the fundamental shift in power that had occurred when Lyra claimed her birthright. The war beast's ultimate loyalty no longer belonged to the Alpha King, but to the Alpha Queen who had awakened to her true nature. "Then what are your orders, Your Majesty?" King Darius asked, his voice formal but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been pride. Lyra looked out over the chaos of the battlefield, her awakened senses taking in every detail of the tactical situation. She could feel the fear and confusion of the liberated war beasts, could sense their desperate need for direction and purpose. They were weapons without wielders, powers without guidance, dangerous to everyone, including themselves. "I'm going to call them home," she said, her decision crystallizing with absolute certainty. "All of them, every war beast in the compound, enemy-controlled or not. I'm going to bring them back to their true purpose." King Darius's expression shifted from concern to something that looked like awe. "That's never been attempted before. The risk—" "The risk is mine to take," Lyra cut him off, stepping forward into the open space where her voice would carry to every creature in the compound. "Stand back, both of you." She closed her eyes and reached out with her awakened power, her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her physical form. The telepathic network that connected her to Fenris widened, stretching to encompass every war beast within miles. She could feel their minds, confused and frightened and desperate for something to anchor them in the chaos. "Come home," she called to them, her mental voice carrying the authority of royal blood and ancient right. "Remember who you are. Remember who you serve." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every war beast in the compound froze mid-action, their heads turning toward her with perfect synchronization. The ones that had been attacking Northern Pack soldiers stopped their assault. The ones that had been fleeing in terror halted their panicked flight. Even the beasts under enemy control broke free from their handlers, their deeper loyalty awakening at the call of their true queen. They came to her like a living tide, dozens of massive predators moving with coordinated precision through the smoke and flames. But they didn't come as weapons or tools of war. They came as subjects returning to their sovereign, as guardians answering the call of the one they were sworn to protect. King Darius watched the unprecedented display with growing amazement, but it was the look in his eyes that took Lyra's breath away. Not just respect or admiration, but something deeper and more profound. Recognition of her power, yes, but also recognition of her worthiness to wield it. "Now do you see?" Fenris asked, his mental voice warm with satisfaction. "Do you see why I could never serve another? Why my loyalty could only ever belong to her?" The enemy forces found themselves facing not just an organized resistance, but a supernatural phenomenon they had no preparation for. Their carefully planned assault crumbled as the war beasts they had hoped to use against the Northern Pack turned instead into an unstoppable force defending their awakened queen. "Your Majesty," King Darius said, his voice carrying formal recognition and something warmer beneath the surface. "I believe you've just won us this war." Lyra opened her eyes, feeling the weight and wonder of her newfound authority settling around her like a cloak. The frightened servant girl who had scrubbed floors and endured mockery was gone forever, replaced by someone who could command loyalty through power that ran deeper than fear or training. "No," she corrected, looking at him with eyes that blazed with silver light. "We've won it, together." And for the first time since the battle began, King Darius smiled.